Good evening, everybody, and thank you again for joining us in our journey through the book of Ephesians. My name is Ken Chapman. Co-host is Jonathan Caldwell, and we've been your guides, so to speak, through Paul's epistle to the church at Ephesus. And tonight's study, Jonathan finds us in Ephesians chapter 5, in a very familiar text in Ephesians 5, verses 22 through 33. Jonathan, I did a very non-scientific research and determined that I have heard 238 sermons from this section of scripture, and I'm sure you've probably heard that many yourself. It's a very familiar text for obvious reasons. But Jonathan, good to see you tonight.
Well, I'm not as old as you, so you've probably heard a few more than me.
Good point. Good point. Well, get us started, Jonathan, if you will, just by reading the text for us tonight.
Ephesians 5, verses 22 through 33. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband.
Okay, I don't know that we have anything necessarily profound or new to point out to you in this text tonight. As I said, jokingly, this has been the source text for so many sermons and Bible classes, but it does bear repeating and us looking at it again tonight. Obviously, we could take this text and just divide it in half, not equal halves, but into two parts. One section talking to the wives, and Paul uses a simile here that wives are like the church. And in that regard, husbands are like or as Christ. And so again, we can divide this into two different sections, the instructions and obligations placed upon wives, and then the instructions and obligations placed upon husbands. And so let's just do that. Wives, here are your obligations. You are to submit and to respect. Just as the church is to submit and respect Christ, its head, wives are to submit and to respect their husbands, who are the head of the wives. And then again, husbands are to love, nourish, and cherish, because that's what Christ has done for the church, and husbands have that obligation as well. And so again, a very simplistic kind of summarization of these verses is that wives, like the church, are to submit and respect, and husbands, like Christ did, are to love, nourish, and cherish their wives, as he says, as their own bodies. And so those are the obligations that he's placed upon each party that they have in this union, this respective union that they have one toward another. Jonathan, do you have any thoughts or comments about those dual obligations of husbands and wives in the marriage relationship?
I find it interesting that everyone translated and interpreted this pretty much the same way for about 1,960 some odd years. And starting maybe 50, 60 years ago with the women's lib movement, this began to be read in different ways. And as I was preparing for this study, I was reading a commentary in which the guy was going out of his way to explain how this couldn't really be the idea of women being subject to their husbands. It has to mean something else. And we do this dance all around the main point of the whole section. And furthermore, you continue into chapter 6, which we will next week. You see that this same idea of subjection is being made when it comes to children and parents and slaves and masters. And so we completely throw off the obvious reading here to fulfill some kind of predetermined theological idea that God would never give these separate roles, or this idea of hierarchy is somehow just unfair to the women, and that they are somehow put out of place. They are somehow looked down upon, and we allow our feelings, our modern day ideas, to reinterpret the text for us. And I think Paul would say, I meant what I said, and I said what I meant. It was pretty obvious what I was getting at here. Why are you messing with it? And so, as I read through this, and you have the same thing in passages like 1 Corinthians 14, 1 Timothy as well, anything that talks about the women's roles. And yet, when you look at the woman's role, it is one of great importance. It is one of God telling them what they should do and how what they do is so beneficial. And then men are seen by the modern world as somehow sitting on a throne, just making commands and bossing people around. And that's not what you see here. Leadership or authority carries with it this idea of intense service. And so it's not like authority is somehow making us better or more important. It's just a different role that we are called to play. And who are we to question God in these things? Ken, I'll step off my soapbox and turn it back to you.
No, you make an excellent point. And I guess the question that came to my mind as you were stating that is, if Paul had intended to speak of headship or authority and submission, what words would he have used?
Exactly.
Other than head, submit, in everything. What simile or what analogy would he use if he intended to say, if he really meant to say, husbands are the head and wives are to submit? What analogy would he have used other than Christ and the church? So,
well, let me just go ahead and make the rest of everyone mad who might hear this. The same point I've often made of baptism. If baptism does save you from your sins, how would God say that other than believe and be baptized and you shall be saved? Repent and be baptized for the forgiveness of sins. Or I don't know, maybe baptism now saves you. We take what is very clear and kind of turn it inside out to try and say something that's obviously not as clear and really doesn't even fit the context.
Yeah. And folks, sometimes Jonathan will tell a joke and I won't laugh. And Jonathan will say, I guess you didn't get it. And to which I usually reply, Jonathan, just because I didn't laugh doesn't mean I didn't understand it. And so the point here is just because I may not like what Paul by inspiration says here doesn't mean that I don't understand it. And that's not what he intended to say. And so my personal opinions of how I would have ordered marriage or the church really are immaterial in this. But I will point out that when we talk about submission and headship, as Jonathan alluded to in his discussion as well, that's not speaking of the idea of superiority and inferiority. I use the analogy sometimes of different tools that we might use. Think of a shovel and a rake. We understand they're two very different tools used for two very different purposes. And if I ask you which was better, which was superior, a shovel or a rake, your reply would be, well, it depends on what job I'm trying to do. And so I believe that God made man and women different, and he made them suited for the particular jobs and roles that they would fulfill. And one is superior than the other when it comes to whatever task we might be assigned. Women are superior when it comes to certain tasks. Men are superior when it comes to other tasks. And vice versa. We're both inferior in those regards. But God in his wisdom gave us separate roles to perform. And I believe that he equipped us for those roles. And so, again, the summarization here is wives, like the church, are to submit and respect. Husbands, like Christ did the church, are to love, nourish, and cherish her. We may point out just some of the statements in here of what Christ did for the church, and it speaks to the care that husbands are have for their wives. He gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. Speaks there of the extraordinary care and love that Christ, even in a position of authority and headship, had for the church. And so I would say the challenge to us husbands is, do we have that kind of care? Are we willing, or do we just want to set up and say, I'm the head, you serve me, you do everything for me? We've completely misunderstood what Christ did for the church as the head of that church. Jonathan?
Do you think that there's a one-to-one parallel between what Christ does for the church, that man does those same things for the wife in some way? Or do you think that this is just a collection of how Christ has served in this position, the church, and man in the same way, and in all these ways should serve his wife and take care of her?
I would tend to think the latter. I mean, you could probably find some kind of parallel throughout marriage and what Christ did for the church, but yeah, I tend to think of it as just a summarization of the care of how he loved, nourished, and cherished. And we're to have that same type of care, not necessarily corresponding to the same exact things. That would be my interpretation of that.
You start down that road, and since he doesn't specify, you wind up with some speculation, and maybe some you think this means that, I think this means that, and so I would agree that it's probably that second one. And I appreciate the way you keep it coming back to the love, nourish, and cherish. Whatever needs to be done in terms of those three things are what we must do.
And so he makes the correlation to husbands, and he says, he who loves his wife loves himself, and that husbands are to love their wives as their own bodies. Now, I would ask you a question now, Jonathan. Do you think that is simply saying that under normal circumstances, we love ourselves, we nourish and cherish our own bodies, and so we ought to love our wives the same way, nourish and cherish our wives the same way that we love, nourish, and cherish our own bodies, which is I think the easy and obvious answer? Or is this some allusion to the verse that's coming up from Genesis chapter 2, where in some sense they are one body? And so when it says that I love my wife as my own body, because in a sense she is my own body, speaking of the idea of the unity in marriage, not just I love her like I love myself, but I love her because she is a part of myself.
I like both of those points, to be honest. I think they're both applicable here, and maybe let me add, might be kind of a branch from the first one, or maybe it's just a different one altogether. A third option, that the way you naturally do what needs to be done for yourself. You get hungry, you eat. You get tired, you sleep. It's natural. Something's very wrong if we're harming ourselves, but in the way that it's natural to take care of yourself, so it is natural for you to take care of your wife.
Yeah, the good points of how we are to nourish and cherish our wives whom we love. So To me, there's two verses, two sentences in here that really stand out to me as maybe needing some further explanation other than the obvious. And one is this quotation from Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, that says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." Now, as you know, that's a quotation from the creation scene in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, where God created woman to be an answer or a suitable mate for man. And this is spoken of at least three times in the New Testament. Jesus quotes this in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 5 when he's answering the Pharisees' question about is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason. Paul alludes to Genesis 2:24 in 1 Corinthians 6 verse 16, where he's talking about the sin of joining yourself to a harlot and therefore becoming one flesh with her. And then obviously Paul again here in Ephesians 5 verse 31 in his discussions of the obligations of husbands and wives. And it seems to me that this fundamental passage, Genesis 2 verse 24, in talking about the marriage union, the marriage relationship, is multifaceted and makes multiple points. I think originally in Genesis, it's talking about the intent of marriage. This was the purpose. That's why God, from one flesh, Adam, made two, to show that in marriage, two shall become one. And will really be one flesh. And so it speaks to the kind of the intent or the purpose of marriage. It seems to me that the thrust of Jesus' point in Matthew 19, in answering again the question, is it lawful to divorce for any reason? Jesus quotes this passage to speak of the permanence of marriage. In a simple answer, he says, no, you should not divorce for just any reason because God has joined them together and they've become one flesh. And Jesus' conclusion is what God has joined, let not man separate. And so he speaks there of the permanence of marriage. Now, obviously, in the passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, where Paul says if we join ourselves to a harlot, we become one flesh with her, that he's speaking of the intimacy, of the intimate relationships inside of marriage, which maybe simply are an illustration or a manifestation of this one flesh concept. And here in Ephesians 5, he quotes this passage to speak of the unity, that they become one flesh. And so there is a unity there. And there are, as he's enumerated prior, there are some obligations to both parties to maintain that unity, to maintain that one flesh. Wives have certain responsibilities to maintain the unity of the one flesh. Husbands have certain obligations to maintain the unity of that one flesh. And so this very fundamental passage, Genesis 2, verse 24, speaks of so many different facets and components of the marriage relationship. You have any thoughts about that, Jonathan?
I love the chart. I think it's fascinating that what God says there in Genesis 2 is almost enough to make all the points that he wants to make about marriage. And so I really appreciate that fact. And then I'm kind of thinking here about how this maybe goes back to Ephesians chapter 4 and those pillars of unity and the right attitudes that one needs to have and the right doctrine that one needs to have to maintain that unity. You have something a little similar here as we think about this relationship between husband and wife.
That's a perfect segue, Jonathan, that as he's talked about unity and the obligations to unity that we have in the church, he's now talking about unity and the obligations that husbands and wives have to unity in the marriage. And that brings us to the next verse that we want to kind of highlight. When Paul says in verse 32, this mystery is profound. And I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. Now, he has been going back and forth in his simile of Christ and the church, husbands and wives. And now he says, near the conclusion of this section, that the mystery is profound, and I'm saying it refers to Christ and the church. So, Paul, what are you saying when you say that? It seems to me that he's simply saying that 2 points are being made in this context. Number one is, I'm talking to husbands and wives. The whole context spends so much time of talking to the obligations of husbands and wives. The concluding verse here in verse 33 tells us that he intended for this message to be directed to husbands and wives. The section that follows in chapter 6 that talks about children to parents and parents to children puts it in the context of those obligations that we have in the family. And so obviously there's a lesson to be made here, an application to be made to the family relationship. But it seems to me that he's also saying there is an application to be made to Christ and the church. Of the idea of unity and maintaining that unity in the body. Notice he used the marriage relationship and spoke of it as being one body. Well, what one body has he been talking about from chapter 1 on? It's the church. In fact, Jonathan, if we go back to the verse prior to this section in chapter 5, verse 21, he told these Christians and us today that they were to be submitting to one another out of reference to Christ, or reverence to Christ. And so just as we, members of the body, submit to Christ because he is our head, that maintains unity in the body. In the same way, unity in the body, the one flesh of marriage, can be maintained much the same way. In fact, it brings to mind what he had said back in chapter 2. In verse 15, he said, in speaking of the unity of the body, the church, he said, by abolishing the law of commandments and ordinances, that he, that's Christ, might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace. And so there's that again, out of two was made one, two was Jew and Gentile, one body was made. In the marriage relationship, two husbands and wives, one body is made. And in both relationships, there's obligations that we must fulfill in order to maintain that unity to the head, from the head to the body. Any thoughts or comments, Jonathan?
It's not like he just gets to 5:21 here and thinks, oh, well, I got a little room left on the scroll. I'll say something about marriage. You see this desire for unity within the church. And speaking of unity, we can talk about this kind of a thing as it applies in our daily lives, our daily relationships. Especially, Paul says some very strong things about, there's neither male nor female, Gentile, Jew, slave, or free. But he kind of comes back to that here and says, now, obviously, in the kingdom, those things are not emphasized, but in your real lives, those roles still exist. And here's how you must, act in those roles. And so he does give us some application here, but it's not like he's just, exited the interstate of his main point to talk about something else or to finish up what little room he had on the scroll here.
Yeah, sometimes just they come together and you can make 2 points in one section. And I think that's exactly what he's doing here, almost in a transition kind of way, merging these two applications.
Let me say one more thing about this phrase. It's almost like he's saying that the marriage relationship has always pointed to something greater than itself. It's so intimate. It was the first real relationship that was in existence between humans. And before there was a parent-child relationship, there was husband and wife. And it's always pointed to something greater. And now that's just spelled out for us. I am saying, let me be very clear, Paul says, it's about Christ and the church.
Now, Jonathan, are you saying that in seeing that we can see the manifold wisdom of God being made known in the church? And I think that's good. That's, I think, what we're seeing here, that only God could make these points and make everything kind of come together in one.
Tie all those threads together.
Exactly, exactly. So he really concludes with this to again remind us that this is talking about both. And so he says, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Now, I might argue that this is the most neglected verse in this whole section. We talk about the dual roles of husbands and wives prior, but this is such a profound verse because to me it speaks really to human nature, that what both parties in a marriage long for and what they need to survive and thrive in a marriage. Wives need to be loved. They need to be loved, nourished, and cherished. Husbands, they need to be respected. And if each party, if wives are seeing to it that they respect their husbands and husbands are loving their wives, then unity can be maintained in this one body and this one flesh. And sometimes we get those reversed, and we think the other partner needs what I need. But Paul is reminding us here by inspiration of what each party needs, and that is the wives need love and the husbands need respect. And that's the obligations that we have to maintain the unity in this one flesh, one body relationship. So, all right, that brings us to a conclusion this time. We thank you again for joining us. Next Monday night at 6:30, Jonathan will be leading us in a discussion starting in Ephesians chapter 6. We move into the last chapter of the book of Ephesians, and we hope that you can join us then next time.